What if the gods never left? What if everything we've been told about ancient mythology is backwards? What if the stories we dismiss as primitive superstition are actually advanced science we've forgotten how to read? What if India wasn't just blessed by random divine favor, but was deliberately engineered as a testing ground for something far more extraordinary than we've imagined? What if the gods didn't stop coming? What if we simply stopped recognizing them? The hidden pattern. Imagine for a moment that consciousness isn't produced by the brain but received by it, like a radio tuning into a signal that exists independent of the device. What if certain geographical locations, through a combination of magnetic fields, mineral deposits, and geometric alignations, create natural amplification zones for this consciousness signal? What if ancient India wasn't randomly chosen but carefully selected because the Himalayan geological formation, the specific river systems, and the electromagnetic properties of the land created a natural laboratory for consciousness experimentation? The Dashavatara suddenly looks different through this lens. What if these weren't 10 separate divine beings descending at random intervals, but a single, coordinated program, a systematic introduction of evolutionary templates into human consciousness? What if Matsya, Kurma, and Varaha weren't just symbols of evolutionary stages, but actual encoded information packets designed to accelerate biological and spiritual development? What if evolution on Earth wasn't purely random mutation and natural selection, but had occasional interventions, upgrades to the operating system, so to speak, and the avatar stories are the encrypted records of those upgrades? The frequency hypothesis? What if the ancient rishis weren't religious mystics, but scientists working with technologies we've only recently begun to rediscover? What if Sanskrit mantras aren't prayers, but precise frequency formulas designed to alter consciousness and even physical reality? Modern cymatics shows us that sound creates geometric patterns in matter. Specific frequencies produce specific forms. What if the elaborate fire rituals, the precise pronunciation of mantras, the geometric yantras? What if all of this was an advanced technology for manipulating reality through frequency and vibration? What if the reason avatars manifested in India specifically is because this is where the technology to perceive, invite, and stabilize higher dimensional consciousness into physical form was most developed? What if other civilizations had visits from the same source but lacked the framework to fully anchor and utilize these manifestations? The Greek gods remained on Olympus, separate, distant. The Norse gods lived in Asgard, another realm entirely. But in India, the technology existed to bring higher consciousness fully into human form, to walk among people, to teach, to demonstrate, to leave detailed instructions. What if that's not mythology? What if that's a technical achievement? The dimensional door quantum physics tells us that particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. What if consciousness is the collapsing force that turns probability into actuality? What if sufficiently advanced consciousness can collapse probabilities with intention, manifesting specific outcomes, even specific forms? What if avatars are exactly this? Highly evolved consciousness that has mastered the ability to collapse quantum probability fields into specific physical manifestations? What if the miracles described in ancient texts, appearing and disappearing, being in multiple places, transforming objects, defying physical laws, are simply demonstrations of consciousness operating with complete understanding of quantum mechanics? String theory proposes 11 dimensions, most of which remain curled up, invisible to our three-dimensional perception. What if higher dimensional beings exist? And what if India developed the specific practices, meditation, mantra, ritual, to create temporary bridges between dimensions? What if the elaborate temple architecture with its precise geometric ratios and resonant chambers wasn't built to worship gods, but to create stabilized dimensional portals? What if the rituals performed there aren't superstitious offerings, but activation sequences? The right combination of sound, symbol, and intention needed to open these portals. What if the gods never left because the portals are still there, still functional? We've simply forgotten the access codes? The DNA conspiracy. What if the Avatar narrative contains an even more startling possibility? What if advanced consciousness doesn't just visit, but directly modifies human genetics? Modern science has discovered that human DNA contains vast stretches of junk DNA, sequences that don't code for proteins and whose function remains mysterious. What if this isn't junk at all, but dormant code waiting for activation? What if each Avatar incarnation actually introduced new genetic information into humanity's collective DNA? What if Narasimha, the half-lion, half-human Avatar, represents a moment when animal instinct was balanced with emerging self-awareness? And what if this story encrypts an actual genetic modification that occurred in human development? What if Rama represents the activation of ethical reasoning centers in the brain? What if Krishna unlocked capacities for paradoxical thinking and meta-awareness? What if the purpose of avatars was never to save humanity from external threats, but to systematically upgrade human consciousness from within by introducing new genetic possibilities that would unfold over generations? What if we all carry avatar DNA, dormant sequences waiting for the right conditions, the right practices, the right understanding, the right frequency to activate? What if meditation, yoga, and mantra aren't spiritual practices but genetic activation protocols? The civilization code, what if India's unique spiritual orientation, the focus on moksha rather than power, wasn't cultural accident, but deliberate design? What if a civilization had to develop specific values and practices before it could safely handle the technology of consciousness? Other ancient civilizations developed impressive material technologies, architecture, mathematics, metallurgy, warfare. But what if they failed a crucial test? What if the technology of consciousness can't be given to civilizations oriented toward domination and control because the results would be catastrophic? What if avatars only manifest in contexts where the collective consciousness has developed sufficient ethical sophistication? What if India became the testing ground because the philosophical framework of dharma, karma, and moksha created a container stable enough to work with these powerful forces? What if the reason avatars seem to stop appearing isn't that they stopped coming, but that collective consciousness degraded to a point where it could no longer perceive or properly interact with them? What if Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness in Hindu cosmology, isn't about the gods abandoning us, but about us losing the perceptual and ethical development necessary to recognize them? The personal revelation. What if the most radical possibility is the one hidden in plain sight? What if avatar doesn't mean God descending, but consciousness remembering? What if Rama, Krishna, and Buddha weren't external beings but human individuals who fully activated the latent potential within human consciousness, who demonstrated what becomes possible when dormant DNA awakens, when the full capacities of the brain come online, when consciousness recognizes its own nature? What if the difference between an ordinary human and an avatar is simply awareness? What if every human carries the complete template but lives in a kind of voluntary amnesia, convinced they're limited, separate, powerless? What if the avatar stories aren't about worshiping extraordinary beings, but about providing a roadmap, showing what humans actually are beneath the conditioning, fear, and cultural programming that keeps consciousness contracted? What if Jesus saying, "These things I do, you shall do also, and greater," wasn't metaphor? What if Buddha saying, "I am awake," was an invitation, not a claim to uniqueness? What if Krishna telling Arjuna, "You are that," was literal instruction? What if the next avatar isn't coming from somewhere else, but emerging from within, as individual humans begin activating the dormant capacities encoded in their own consciousness? The experiment continues. What if modern technology, the internet, global communication, rapid information exchange, is creating conditions for a collective awakening unprecedented in human history? What if the isolation that once required geography to create consciousness, laboratories can now happen globally Simultaneously? What if the reason you're reading these words right now is an accident? What if there's a pattern to who gets curious about these questions? Who feels the pull toward ancient wisdom? Who suspects that consensus reality is missing something fundamental? What if you're part of the experiment? What if the avatar code is activating in you right now, has been activating, is the reason certain ideas resonate while others feel hollow? What if your seemingly random interests, meditation, quantum physics, ancient temples, consciousness studies, aren't random at all, but pieces of a puzzle assembling itself? What if India was phase 1, the prototype, the proof of concept? What if the current moment, with all its chaos and transformation, is phase 2, the global activation? What if the gods never left because they were never separate? What if the divine has always been the deepest nature of consciousness itself, playing an elaborate game of forgetting and remembering? What if the only thing standing between you and avatar consciousness is the belief that it's impossible? The ancient texts remain, the practices endure, the portals still exist in sacred geometry and sound. The DNA waits, patient and timeless. The question isn't whether gods walk among us. The question is, are you ready to recognize them in the mirror?